Ladies and gentlemen, may I call you to order? Thank you very much. First of all, on behalf of the Danube Institute, I'd like to welcome you to this occasion, and I look forward to a lively debate and discussion. We're very fortunate to have as our speaker today Michael Horowitz. I'm going to describe him very briefly, but I think in the course of the evening you'll find out many things about his career, which is extremely various and has been very fruitful in particular ways. He is a graduate of the Yale Law School. He was a professor of law in the Ole Miss University in the 60s, where he was very active in promoting the civil rights cause at a time when, of course, it was very much a disputed cause in the American South. He, for most of his life, I think chronologically, you were a Democrat, but you became a Republican, and quite quickly was entered the White House, where Michael was the general counsel at OMB. OMB is the Office of Management and Budget. It's equivalent to, it means you have a say, something to say on every aspect of American government, since OMB looks at the spending. Of course, his influence at the White House went wider than that. Since leaving the White House, he has been active in Washington politics in a very particularly creative and interesting way. He has put together what I always call coalitions of incompatible groups. That is to say, he's managed to persuade people who are generally seen as being on different sides of politics, for example, the feminists on the left and the evangelical Protestants on the right, and other such combinations. He's managed to put together these combinations to fight for various human rights causes in the US Congress. We were colleagues at the Hudson Institute, where for many years he was a major fellow. He and I actually worked together on another organization called the 21st Century Initiatives, again designed to advance Michael's program, which he called the Wilberforce Agenda, an attempt to persuade the right in American politics to embrace a series of civil rights and human rights causes around the world at a time of budgetary stringency. So quite a difficult thing to do. He has helped to write a series of important pieces of American legislation. For example, I'll mention two: the International Religious Freedom Act, which gave a responsibility to the American government and the State Department to monitor the treatment of religious freedom in various countries. And secondly, the Prison Rape Elimination Act. Again, I think he'll be talking about these things in the course of his remarks, but it gives me great pleasure to introduce Michael Horowitz, who will talk to us on the diplomacy of human rights. Michael.
Well, thank you, John. Whenever I get introductions like this, it always troubles me. I'm persuaded that I led this useful life. I only wish my wife were here and she could be as persuaded. Then this would be an enormously successful experience for me. I do want to talk about the human rights subject, which I believe is a subject and an agenda largely ignored by both the left and the right, at great cost and risk to both, and at great cost to the prospects of the 21st century, at great cost to the hope that the 21st century will be less bloody than the 20th has been. I believe that these issues, human rights issues properly defined, have great policy and, here's where the politicians live, political potency. And both left and right ignore the power of those issues, with the fault largely being the fault of the right, for the reason I will get to in a moment. But before I do, let me define what I mean by human rights. I do not mean advancement of middle-class interests, important as they may be. So I do not, when thinking of human rights in terms of women's agendas, think of the glass ceilings and of the fact that only 2% of women are in senior government jobs or CEOs of companies. It may well be that we lose much by not having more women in higher positions. But I don't think of that as a human rights issue, because I think in this debate, in this argument, one side can give as good as the other side can get. And I leave it to the political process and the social process for progress to be made and for decisions to be made. I don't mean here in the United States there's a great debate over abortion. I don't mean this to cover the abortion issue, at least in the sense in which it's understood, because women and men, secular and religious, give as good as they get and let the winner win and persuade the other side. And the political process and the democratic process works to come up with never perfect solutions, but good solutions, peaceful solutions, accommodating solutions. I don't mean the rights of gays, as important as I think they are and as determined as I am, that there should not be discrimination in employment or otherwise against gays. I do mean human rights to cover gays when gays are subject to murder, to torture, as they are in some countries, at which case, by my definition, it becomes a human rights issue that both left and right should be at with all the power at their command. The test, as I say, is, can one side in the debate give as good as it gets, or almost as good as it gets? And if it can, if there is power enough to defend its own position, I say it's an important issue. I say we ought to be on whichever side we think is the right issue as citizens participating in the political process. But I want to define human rights issues in the classic way it was defined. That is, taking up on behalf of the truly powerless, of the persecuted, of the murdered, of the tortured, of which there are tens of millions in this world today, whose conditions and whose positions and whose cries are significantly ignored, as I say, by both right and left. Now, right and left ignore these issues for entirely different reasons, I think. The left ignores the issue for human and perfectly understandable reasons. The reason being that they get credit for them no matter what they do. There is that prevailing sense, and you know the old story that's 100 years old. I saw the quote first developed 100 years ago, the idea that if you were young and not of the left, you didn't have any heart. The other side of the coin is if you got older and were not a conservative, you didn't have a brain. But I think that's much more ignored and much less relevant than the fact that the left has captured for 100 years the moral enthusiasms of the young. And in a society of the sort we happily have, not entirely happily, but happily have, where the young and the spirit of the young are admired, that is an advantage that the left has, and the left understands the power of being the caring side in the debate. They don't earn it, but they understand it. The reverse is pretty true, I think, with the right. Today, the right accepts to too great a degree, and almost completely in some cases, the definition made of it by the left. That we care about practical solutions, that we care about, that we are interested in the side with power, that we are content to allow ourselves to be defined by the sins that were committed in our name in years and centuries past. We accept that. I say we as conservatives accept that at our grave cost, and it costs a larger interest even than our own well-being. But let me tell you how caring counts and how silly it is for conservatives not to enter this battle. to seize ownership of the side that cares for the poor, for the victimized, for the hopeless, for the persecuted. In the United States election before this, 20% of the American voting population said, "I vote for the candidate who cares the most." That's 1 out of every 5 votes. What do you think the split was between left and right, between Obama and Romney? The voting split of that 20% was 82 to 18. That's monumental in politics. In politics, if you win by 55% of the vote, you've won a landslide. 82 to 18, the conservative candidate lost. In the United States today, with Trump as president, who may be doing lots of things, but who again, well, let me say, here's Trump as a perfect example. We have senior positions in the United States government, the Undersecretary for Human Rights, the number 3 position in the State Department, the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, the head of the Trafficking Office, the senior official in the National Security Council with the Human Rights Portfolio. Trump's been in office for 14 months. The jobs are unfilled. They're regarded as unimportant, or if anything, they'll get in the way of our muscular policy that we favor. And what's the net of that? 32%, the margin between the Democrats and the Republicans amongst college-educated Republican women is reported as a 32% voting gap. Suburban districts. I live in one of the wealthiest per capita districts in the United States. It was traditionally a conservative Republican district. It has now become a Democratic district because they don't want to associate with people who don't care. When you get rich enough, you get generous, you want to be decent, you want to be thought of as decent. You want your children not to call you indecent. And so this is what's been happening to votes in the United States. Now, Trump won the election. And I don't have enough familiarity entirely, obviously, with the Hungarian policy, but Orban is in some ways the same position as Trump is in. I don't know what percent, he won by an enormous margin, but I will say this to every politician in a democratic society: you better not sacrifice a single vote you do not need to sacrifice, because you're going to need them in the next election. And I would say that to Trump, I would say that to Orban, that being on the side of, anger and grievance, rather than hope and possibility, which is the label that the left gives itself, will cost you, and cost you more and more in the future. And will make it harder and harder to regain the people you lost, because your voting allegiance doesn't become a rational matter based on the issues. Increasingly, it becomes a matter of identity. So if you go to college and everybody thinks Orban is terrible and thinks Trump is terrible, it takes an act of courage to say, well, they're not so bad. It becomes much easier to assume a personal identity, which is very, very hard to shift and very, very hard to change. But it is changeable, and here's what I would say to conservative politicians. You don't need to take that 20% that you just lost, 82 to 18. All you need to do is lose that group by 62 to 38. Still an enormous difference. And that extra 4% of the vote you get in election after election, added to the majorities that you now have, mean you are the majority party for the next 20 years. We sacrifice those votes, and the left doesn't earn those votes, but understands the power and the importance of those votes. Now, what I say about conservative politics, I think can be said even more so in the case of Christians. I was very deeply involved and put together the coalition that passed in the United States the International Religious Freedom Act that dealt with the worldwide persecution of Christians very particularly. And it was an astonishing discovery for me as a Jew to see the extent of it, and it was frightening in this sense. We had a housekeeper in our house who came to us and said he had just escaped from Ethiopia, where he was hung upside down, beaten with steel rods, and had hot oil poured over his back. And he'd be murdered. He had just escaped from Ethiopia, and he'd be murdered if he were returned to Ethiopia. I called up one of the leading immigration lawyers in the United States and said, well, we've got to get him a refugee status, a green card. She said, of course we will. If what you tell me is anything like being true, we will get him a green card and do it very quickly. And by the way, she said, why was he beaten and tortured? Well, I said, because he's a Christian, because he was running an underground Christian church in Ethiopia. Well, she said, we don't do Christians here in America. Aren't they the ones who do the persecuting? That is the caricature by a very sophisticated immigration lawyer. She could get everybody threatened with gay, but here are Christians who are being persecuted in the most extraordinary ways, by the way. It scared me. One of the things that scared me as I began as a Jew to become involved in the issue of Christian persecution was the language was word for word the same as was used to excuse the persecution of Jews in the same fancy dinner parties in Washington and New York. I'm against violence, you know, but I wouldn't want them as neighbors. They bring it on themselves. They're clannish and so forth. The justification for indifference to the persecution of Christians was precisely in the same words as it was for Jews. And I became involved and found that Christians were unable to defend themselves in the common culture. They would talk about the good things they did. They talked defensively, but they were unable to articulate the virtue of what they had to offer, at least in the United States. And it was I who was able to say to them, listen, if it wasn't for the rooted Christian decency of America, I would be a lampshade or a bar of soap today. Can I really say that? Christian leaders would say to me. And that is what I say to conservatives in the same way. Do not you have allowed the common culture, the elite culture, to define you in terms of the sins committed in your name rather than in the net effect that you have produced, and that is particularly true of Christians. Now, by the way, this is an argument that has to be made in the United States and in Europe, not in Asia. The paradigm Christian 50 years ago was a white Western male. Today, she's a brown or a yellow female. And if you ask the government of China who they are most threatened by, it's the house churches. It used to be in Europe. If you wanted to know if people were free in Europe, you wouldn't have to conduct a fancy survey. You would go to the local synagogue, and if the Jews were terrified and frightened, nobody was free. Today, go to a house church in China. Today, look at the fact that the North Korean government will murder you on the spot if they catch you with a Bible. Look at what's happening in Cuba, in Venezuela, in all of the world's dictatorships. Dictators are very shrewd people, you know. They know who their enemies ought to be. That's why they're still alive, and that's why they're in power. And yet they regard it as essential to their survival to step down on these little house churches, sending pastors in China to jail for having crosses on their buildings, because they see that 60 million, 100 million house church Christians in China are growing in numbers, that 60% of all the college graduates want to learn more about Christianity. Well, we don't understand it, and Christians in the West and Christians in Hungary don't understand it, and therefore are defensive, are ineffective in defining themselves on the side of the weak, the poor, the vulnerable, the persecuted. Well, and what Christians do and what conservatives do are defensive strategies. In the case of Christians, they go into the little bubble and they talk to each other, and they tell each other they're really terrific. They're afraid to go out into the common culture and really defend themselves because they go into the teeth of rejection and dismissal and being patronized, and the power of those of an establishment and of the left's story to define them in terms of sins committed in their names is so overwhelming and so strong that they retreat to the bubble, to the enclave. In the case of conservatives, I see it here, I see it with Trump, the appeal, as I say, is to anger and grievance, not the hope, not the concern. The idea of saying, I'm a conservative and I'm a conservative because I care about the poor and the persecuted, it just seems strange. John has said, I was a professor of civil rights law at the University of Mississippi. I taught the first integrated classes. The Ku Klux Klan was out to get me all of the time. And I then say to people, well, I am a political conservative who worked for Ronald Reagan for the same reason I fought against the Ku Klux Klan. And people say, that can't possibly be. Or even John has to say, he used to be a Democrat, now he's a Republican. That's not quite accurate, John. I was always against segregation, and I was always on the side of that political system, that religious, that cultural system that favored the poor, that gave poor the opportunity for growth and progress, as my family was blessed to enjoy, as my grandparents came from the shtetls of Poland and enjoyed the privileges that we had. Now, Michael Novak, the great theologian, a great dear friend of John's and mine, wrote an article that before I came into the Reagan administration was incredible. It almost became my little text. Michael said, there are three circles of power and influence within governments. The first, he said, was the political, the economic, and then he said the third was the moral cultural. And these were circles that intersected but were separate. And what Michael said to conservatives was that there was balance in the economic sector and the political sector. Democrats could give as good as Republicans. Business could give as good as labor unions, and they fought each other. But in the moral cultural sector, there was complete imbalance. The right allowed the left to dominate. And said, Michael, in an information age, we surrender too much. We surrender the young. We surrender intellectuals. We surrender people who have influence over others. And in doing that, we lose all. He said, and this was textbook for me, he said, we assume that the media is all biased to the left. But he said, you know, the reporters there's a professionalism, whatever their politics. And if we honestly go to them and tell them our story, openly and honestly, it's quite amazing how we get fair treatment. And I used to do that. I used to call up reporters for the New York Times and Washington Post and say, look, you just wrote a story saying that Reagan hates the poor. Let me tell you, here's what the issue was about. And I would discuss whatever the issue was about welfare reform or school discipline or whatever the issue was. And the amazing thing would be the next story that reporter would write would be more fair and balanced than the last one was. I mean, I once had such influence over the White House correspondent for the Washington Post that he got fired from the job. He just didn't know what hit him because I would call him up about these stories. He'd say, that's fair. Oh, I see. Because I had a moral credibility here, and that opened him up to hear me. And the left, even the most avid left, at least most of them, we've won the battle. It's not even a fair battle on the issue of economics. People on the left know deep down, at least enough of them to give us, to split them apart, that economic dynamism is better for the poor than redistribution. They know that markets work better than government. I mean, God help us in Hungary if you don't know that markets work better than government for helping the poor and distributing income, whatever else it may do. Of course they know that. But we have allowed them, by our indifference, I say we conservatives have done it. We have allowed them to move beyond argument into identity, where they're very, very hard to reach. And we are on the defensive, and we can never reach those people if we do not redefine the human rights agenda in ways that Reagan understood. There's this great story of Reagan and human rights and why it's crazy for conservatives to ignore it. George Shultz, the former Secretary of State, told this great story about how Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador, came to Shultz one day and said, I can't get any business done with Reagan. I want to talk to him about missiles, about rubles, about Vietnam, about whatever. And all he wants to do is give me a list of Jewish refuseniks in the Soviet Union and Pentecostals. I can't get a word in. That's all he wants to talk about. And Schultz was very smart. He said, I got the same problem. He really cares. And let me tell you, unless you do business, unless you start releasing those Jews from the Soviet Union, you're not going to, nothing's going to happen here. You're never going to do any business. Now, he won't take advantage, do it quietly. He's not going to brag about it. He'll help, he'll make it as easy for you as possible. But you better start doing it if you want to deal with Reagan. And so it happened. And as the word went out that the 10-foot-tall Soviets couldn't even burn down a synagogue, they didn't seem quite as powerful to everybody else. And the same story is true on the other side with now, when I was working on the issue of Christian persecution, the senior op-ed columnist for the New York Times wrote this column saying, how dare these people worry about Christians persecuted in China? The great symbol for human rights in the whole world is a man named Wei Jingshang, who's been in a Chinese jail for 15 years, and they're taking attention away from him. Now, it was odd that he should say it because the same people who cared about persecuted Christians were the only ones in Congress who cared about Wei Jingshang. But let's leave that aside. What happens was that Wei Jingshang got released from prison while we were fighting to pass the International Religious Freedom Act, over the opposition, by the way, of Madeleine Albright and Bill Clinton. And he becomes our most powerful advocate. He says, look, if the Chinese can't persecute a house church Christian group, if people in the West show that they care about their own, there is freedom for labor unions, freedom for atheists, freedom for everybody else. Just as the Jews were the little canaries in the coal mine, so the Christians were, the symbols of whether there was freedom. So I told Christians, in fighting for your own, you're fighting for everybody else. Don't worry about it. Understand the power, understand what you are for. But you need to do that and shatter the caricature. But here are some of the issues that are important. The first are women's issues. As I said, the idea that women's issues and feminism and the future of women is defined by whether there's 3% or 18% of women, or 42 or 57% of women who are CEOs of corporations, that may be an important battle, but it's nothing compared to what goes on now. Now, I had these I hope we can pass out while we're talking. I want you to look at this paper here to give you a sense of the power of an issue that is up for conservatives to own. I want conservatives to do what I believe. I believe that the 21st century will be defined, when people write the history of the 21st century, they will do it in terms of the impact of computers and the empowerment of women. The fact that women are becoming increasingly more central and powerful is, I think, very essential to the growth of democracy, because it means votes rather than muscular power determine outcomes. I shouldn't have done that. We'll take a look at it just in a moment, but I want to tell you about this in a moment. Here's an issue that is ignored: the mass trafficking of women. In the 19th century, Great Britain, the United States, much of the West was worried about African slavery. Today, the slavery issue of our time is the mass trafficking of tens of millions of women. And by the way, they are the most cherished women are the white Caucasian women from parts of the old Soviet Union who are being trafficked and enslaved. And you look at those photos, and what those photos show, these are photos of girls in the United States. They come from the poorest, most abused homes. And these are photos taken of these women as they were arrested over a period as short as 1 year to 3 years. Look at the first picture, look at the 8th picture. 1 year in some cases. You can't tell it's the same person. Multiply that by 10 million. Hillary Clinton, the great champion of women, wrote a 600-page book on Hard Choices, was the name of it. You know how many times she mentioned the trafficking issue? Zero. Zero. This is the slavery issue of our time. What about female genital mutilation? What about child marriages, age 12? What about honor killing? Now, Orban talks about Islam and so forth, and Trump does, but it comes off as sounding as anti-Muslim bigotry. Whether he intends it or not is not the point. He can be caricatured that way. And as a politician, he ought to know, and we ought to know, that how you get defined, if the other side defines you, if your adversaries define you, you're a rotten politician, even if you get 62% of the vote in the last election. Well, suppose Trump was involved in the issue of trafficking and genital mutilation and child marriages and honor killing and obstetric fistula. There are 3 million women living in the Islamic areas of Africa with obstetric fistula. They get married at 12, the baby comes down the birth canal, it can't fit, the baby tears a hole in the birth canal, the woman becomes incontinent for life, and the baby dies. 3 million women in Africa are treated as commodities, married off at age 12. Suppose conservatives took on that issue, made it the issue, and it would resonate with the decent people of decent countries like this and like America. At that point, these are taking place in Islamist countries, by the way. So instead of being an anti-Muslim bigot, you are for the interest of enslaved and brutalized women who are treated as property. That's an issue that just changes the very shape of the attacks against you. Or take another one, the internet. The Berlin Walls of our time are internet firewalls of the world's dictatorship. The government of China, the premier of China. And by the way, whether or not China becomes a free country or a dictatorship, in my judgment, even more than Islam, will determine the character of the 21st century, whether it is peaceful for your children and grandchildren and mine. The premier of China said, if I cannot purify the internet, I cannot maintain the stability of the socialist state. We have an agency in the United States that is still putting out shortwave radio broadcasts like it was 1982 again, and doing it poorly when everybody in China has a smartphone. We could have communication, the firewalls, the Berlin Walls by which the dictatorships in Iran, in China, openly rely for survival. We could take them down. And it's, by the way, the battle over beating the firewalls is what people would call asymmetric. For every dollar we spend to bypass the firewalls, they have to spend 1,000 to keep them up. And yet we haven't done it. That's something that conservatives can take on. And then, of course, there is the great issue of anti-Semitism, the trump card of the left in painting the right as bad guys. Now, of course, that is there's history that gives it legitimacy. But there is a truth here that conservatives can more confidently assert. And Orban can't simply say, I want Judeo-Christian civilization, when people define Judeo-Christian civilization or Christian civilization as the Holocaust. I mean, you go in the Holocaust Museum in the United States, and there's a film on the history of anti-Semitism, and the takeaway message of this continuous loop, 12-minute film is Martin Luther and a bunch of popes caused Auschwitz. By the way, if you go to Yad Vashem in Israel, Darwin gets as much blame as any Christian, because it really was the Darwinian notion of the Nazis that moved Nazism. It didn't matter what church you went to, it mattered what your blood was that determined it for Nazism. But again, these are the libels, these are the ways in which conservatives and Christians have not defended the virtue and what they have brought to this world. But again, and defensiveness does not work. Here is the reality. In a post-Holocaust world, anti-Semitism is a phenomenon of the left and not of the right. Period. No question whatsoever about it. Yet for every oh gosh, what's the name of the party here in Hungary? How could I forget it?
Fidesz.
No, not Fidesz. The very Jobbik poster of some, Jew with a beard and so forth. Why, those posters get reproduced in the millions by organizations in the United States, Jewish organizations, organizations of the left, because, hey, here's Hungary. Why, the neo-Nazis are about to reinstitute, bring Hitler back to power. I see my great dear friend Tamás Felegi here. There's a wonderful story, and it shows how poorly we have defended, not even defended, but asserted our values and the truth and so forth. I put together a hearing on European anti-Semitism. I got a congressman to do it. The first thing that happened was, hey, I can't just have one on anti-Semitism, well, we put together the hearing. And I helped set up some witnesses, and Tamás was one of the witnesses. And it was just brilliant testimony that everybody ought to read. It was very compelling to members of Congress, and it is still being circulated. And he said, look, there is, of course, anti-Semitism that takes place, of the old-fashioned type, no question. He said, but Jewish life in Hungary is flourishing. The establishment, the left, went insane. They wanted to take him off the witness list. They wanted to have some secular Jew who would say, oh, wait, Orban is an anti-Semite, Jobbik is about to take over the country. By the way, I looked at it, it was very interesting. It was the socialists who didn't want to attack Jobbik either, because they were talking about Jewish bankers dominating the economy here. Anti-Semitism, the point is, you had to see the intensity with which the effort was made to take Tamás off the witness stand, because he was presenting a balanced picture that didn't have the convenient notion that the right-wing Nazis were about to take over and were causing anti-Semitism. One of the witnesses was the chief rabbi of the Ukraine. And when I called him up, he said, what testimony do you want me to give? Do you want me to tell the truth? Or do you want me to tell what Americans want to hear? I said, what do you mean? He said, in the Ukraine, Jews are free. We've got Jewish festivals all over the place. So, but every time I talk to some establishment reporter, he wants to know about all the pogroms that are about to take place. If you want me to talk about pogroms, I'll find an anti-Semite and I'll talk about that. But on the other side of the coin, the head of the Jewish community in Sweden, a leader of the Jewish community in France, they talked about how you couldn't walk down the street of Malmo as a Jew without getting beaten up by the Islamists. And he said, we get no support. Frankly, it wasn't until the murders in Paris that some of the establishment organizations, the so-called human rights organizations, began to talk about Islamist anti-Semitism. And the fault is ours, not theirs. The left has the political advantage in painting us as the anti-Semites, as the uncaring type. When we can capture the freedom of 20 million women like that, the way Wilberforce freed the African slaves, and we don't do it. Now you've got to admit the sins of the past. You've got to deal, but when we do that, we open up all kinds of things. Let me tell you one of the things we open up. You have the credibility to say that when I fight for immigration laws that fairly vet the people who come in to see whether they will assimilate, I am protecting Muslims. Who do you think are the greatest victims of these fascist regimes that have madrasas instead of schools where kids barely learn to read and write, where women are treated as commodities, where female genital mutilation takes place? It's anti-intellectual, it's anti-woman, it's where you get murdered on the spot, if you convert from Islam to any other faith. Where the Yazidis, the Christians, the Jews, as ISIS takes over in these countries, they get slaughtered, they get murdered in Hitler-like pogroms. So when we appease, there's a battle going on for the soul of Islam. Wonderful stories. When I was fighting to pass the International Religious Freedom Act, and trying to deal with the persecution of Christians. I would get calls from leaders of Muslim countries in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Syria. They would say, Mr. Horowitz, and they would do it through cutout telephones at risk of life. You've got to keep up that battle for those Christians. I'd say, what? What do you care? Oh, Mr. Horowitz is a great battle. I'd say, what do you care? He said, don't you understand? If the West is seen as not speaking up for Christians, we know that when the radicals come to us, nobody will care for us. So if you don't stand up for the persecuted Christians, we're the next ones to be persecuted unless we sign on with the radicals. Our hope. There's a battle going on for the soul of Islam now between the Dark Age forces and the forces of modernity. And in allowing the left to take any form of concern about Islamic culture as a sign of bigotry, the biggest victims are Muslims, because we give over Islam to the 9th century Kharijites who want to turn it into fascism, not into religion. So these are the kinds of things that I believe we can seize the ownership of and fight for. We need to do it confidently. And if we do it confidently, we can say, and when Urban talks about Judeo-Christian traditions, he's talking about a tradition of, not a perfect one for sure. Sins get committed in these are human institutions. But we have promoted freedom and democracy and the subversive notion that all men are equal in the eyes of God. We don't always live up to it, but we ought to give ourselves more credit for it than we do to ourselves. But as conservatism, as Christianity begins to say, look, I don't know if you agree with us about whether or not a fetus is a vulnerable human being, or whether or not in fighting for persecuted Christians we're being selfish just for our own. But I want you to understand let's talk about that. But I want you to understand one thing. I care about those persecuted Christians for the same reason I care about those trafficked women. That's what Urban should say. That's what Trump should be able to say. That's what conservatives should be able to say. It won't cost them a single vote. Or let me give you another one. I tried to get through to the Trump people, and I failed. I'm going to keep on trying. And if I sat down with Urban, I would tell Urban the same. And I'm not for Urban or against him. I don't know enough about the politics of this country. But I do know he's not an anti-Semite. He is the guy, he is the one man that I know that there's a robust Jewish life in Hungary. And I know that the Islamists are the ones who are the cause of anti-Semitism of the worst kind in countries where they are not screened before they come in. But here's what I would tell Urban, and here's what I told Trump. Instead of saying all Muslims, we got to be careful about letting people in from those Muslim countries, what you ought to say is, there's a disease going on in the Middle East that the radical Muslim leaders are trying to perpetrate. And history tells us how dangerous that disease is. It's called the virus of anti-Semitism. And we must screen for the virus of anti-Semitism before people come into our country, just like we screen for tuberculosis. What an argument that is. Instead of saying, all Muslims are presumptive terrorists, which sets you up for a charge that you're an anti-Muslim bigot and plays right into the hands of the ones who want to define you, you began saying, I just want to screen out. I don't want to have in Hungary 24/7 police protection in front of every synagogue like they do in France and Sweden. It becomes a very different sort of argument. It becomes a conservatism that cares. Again, it's not hard to do it, but we need to think that way more. When 500 ministers, I'm about to finish, John, when 500 ministers used to come to Washington to witness for social justice, and I'd be in the Reagan administration, all my fellow conservatives would run for the hills, and I would go into the meeting and I would say, look, I'm willing to talk to you, provided only one thing. You have to agree to my ground rules, and if you can't, I'm out of here. Oh, they would smile and they'd think, okay, here it comes. And I would say, look, I want to talk about Reagan's programs for the poor, But I want you to define, I want you to judge what I have to say, not in terms of how much wealth the rich will have to create jobs and businesses. Forget that. I don't want you to judge by my defense of the Reagan administration by how much more comfortable it would make the middle class. I demand that you judge Reagan's conservative policies only in terms of how much hope and opportunity it offers black people in the inner cities who are suffering from joblessness, who have illegitimacy, bad schools. That's the only basis on which I want you to judge conservative policies. Once I did that, it was wide open, and it would always happen in these groups of, hard left people. As I'd be walking out after giving my talk, there'd be 4 or 5 people looking all around as I walked out, and they making sure nobody else was there, and they'd say, I agree with everything you said. And then they would run back inside. Well, all we need to do is pick up that percentage of the people. And let me conclude just with this thought. In talking about taking on trafficking, prison reform, internet firewalls, talking about hope, talking about caring for the poor, without sacrificing in one measure conservative principles. That's terribly important. Often conservatives do it and then they give half a loaf to the left. I'm a hardcore conservative in my policies. Typically at the end of a long speech, I had my really great last thing to say. I think I will until it hits me. Let me close here and simply say that we can take. Oh, I know what my last point was, and it's a critical point. I said, and I speak as a conservative who wants conservative victories. I speak as a Jew who believes that the growth of Christianity, especially in Asia, is the greatest single hope I know for the spread of democracy in China and around the rest of the world. All of the great human rights lawyers, so many of them are Christians. But I do so for a different reason as well. And I say this to my friends on the left, and this is why I can build left-right coalitions. What I want is politics where the debate is on the issues, where it is not possible for one side not to have to listen to the other side because they're bad people. I don't have to hear anything they have to say. The hope of the poor, the hope of our countries is for there be a debate about whose policies work better in terms of what's intended. But as long as caricatures are alive, as long as we conservatives don't fight the caricatures of us, our politics are one side calls the other side names, one side is bad, the other side is good, and it's war between the two, and policies, good policies get to lose. So I say to my fellow conservatives, someday the left may just wake up and begin caring about the poor in a real way, the way they used to. And then you'll be finished. Because then you really will lose the young people, and you'll be able to appeal only to anger and hostility and grievance. And that's not enough to win election after election. You've got to appeal to hope and decency. The left will take it away from you if they get smart, so you better do it right now. And I tell my friends on the right, the left is sleeping. These issues are yours to take over. Miss Orban, become a champion of the rights of women. Talk about how radical Islam carries with it the virus of anti-Semitism so that you are protecting against anti-Semitism, not being an anti-Muslim, as you will be painted as being. These are the things. So I would like to see, in the end, win or lose, I would like to see a democracy where there is open debate, where one side argues with the other about which policies work instead of shouting at each other and going to war with each other. And if this continues, I say as a conservative, it's my fault. It's not the fault of the left. Thank you very much for listening.
Michael, before I throw open the debate to questions and contributions, I had the advantage of being able to look over your shoulder to read your notes, and there was one point I noticed you skipped. I think it was an important one, and that was I think it was when you were talking about obstetric fistula, you did have a point about how a very simple and very cheap method of solving the problems for these women. And I think there are other cases of this as well. And perhaps you could just deal with
Well, obstetric fistula is, again, 3 million women, and about 100, 200,000 a year come, and it's significantly because of child marriages, because of the scarring that takes place with genital mutilation in countries, all Islamic countries, where women are treated as property. Again, the baby comes down that birth canal. Poor countries, the baby head goes back and forth, a tear in the birth canal, and the fistula is torn, and women are if I can say it, defecating out of their vaginas for life. They are smelly women who are in the poorest villages. Nobody talks to them. It costs $200 to sew up the fistula. And we could have programs that are implemented to where the space between the time it takes to get from the village, each particular village, to a hospital that could do a C-section, and there can be a chart that says if the girl doesn't deliver within X hours, 12 hours, you've got to stop the midwife and bring the girl to get a C-section. It won't take much money. It's a teeny fraction of the American budget for child and maternal health care, much of which goes to promote abortion. And we got 3 million women here. That issue of fistula is an issue that would tear at the heart of everybody in the United States and in the West. And you have it here. Hillary's in office for 8 years. Not a word about it. A lot of word about college date rape, which is terrible. Not a word about the fistula of 3 million people. But the chief columnist for the New York Times, a liberal guy, really the leading liberal, he just wrote a book about it. And if the right begins to seize ownership and make a difference with this issue, it will cause nothing. It begins to open up that change. It begins to get people to listen to us. So fistula is a good example, John, of the kinds of things that conservatives and Christians have failed to exploit, that's wide open to be taken by the first group that seizes ownership.
And as I recall, I mean, there are a series of what you might call low-cost human rights initiatives.
Absolutely low cost. Every one of these, by the way, one of the things I learned in government is that when you spend a lot of money on a government program, most of the money goes to the rich, not to the poor. That government is a tool of the rich and the powerful, at least in my experience. Can I give one real quick example here? On the welfare debate, and there's a perfect example of why we don't get listened to when we talk about welfare and helping the poor. The issue of dependency rather than is a powerful issue here, and yet if we were worried about the poor becoming dependent on welfare, we don't care about the poor. Well, Franklin Roosevelt in the United States instituted, as some of you may know, the New Deal. And he had a great reform which I fully support. He said, in a modern industrial society, people who cannot work cannot rely only on family and church to support them. So let's have programs which give modest amounts of cash to the poor, to the deserving poor. And so we got Social Security, we got disability, we got unemployment pay. These were great industrial age reforms that gave dignity to deserving people who, through no fault of their own, found themselves without jobs. Lyndon Johnson came in and said, I want to abolish poverty forever. And these little programs, I'm really going to abolish poverty forever. We're not spending anything like what we need to because we need to care for the poor. So he began what was called the Great Society. Probably within a space of 20 years from the time Johnson began the Great Society, we probably in the United States spent 20 times more money than we did, so-called, on the poor. During that whole period of the 20 years of the Great Society, every sign of pathology of the poor went straight up. Illegitimacy, blackmail participation in the workforce, lack of schooling, crime, you name it. And here's the key. When the Johnson administration took office, when the New Deal programs were working, if every dollar spent on the poor, 85 cents went into the pockets of the poor. Short-term cash. Johnson couldn't do it in cash because it would mean every poor family would get $30,000 a year. That was politically, and nobody would go to work unless they got $60,000 a year. Even he knew that. When we in the Reagan administration came into office, 20 years later, we're spending 20, 30 times more money. And of every dollar going to the poor, guess what? 15 cents went in their pockets, and 85 cents went in people like us, home builders, teachers, schools, city governments, and so forth. Now that's an argument that conservatives can make about, but we have to establish, that's my point, John, credibility that we care about the poor. We have to not feel that when we talk about the poor, we're becoming liberals, we're going to the left. We have the programs for the poor, and the programs of the left said to help the poor line the pockets of the rich more than they help the poor in much of my experience.
Thank you. I think we might just say here that 2 weeks ago there occurred the death of Tom Wolfe, the novelist and new journalist, a great inventor of a new style of journalism. And I think one of his famous essays, which deals exactly with that, is Mau-Mauing the Flat Catchers. We owe a great debt, I think, to the new journalism and to Wolfe and to others who followed in his wake, because it made these issues live, and we understood at the most basic level why people acted as they did. Now, let me now throw open the floor to questions. Who would like to be the first person to speak? Hello. Thanks.
My name's Henry, I'm Irish. In Europe, when we hear about these debates, it just seems to be so polarized and partisan. If we're looking for more information to follow your lead, where do we find it out? Where do we look to see these debates happening in the US?
To see what?
To see the ideas that you're talking about in the US. Where are you finding people who support you? Because it seems so polarized looking from Europe.
Yeah.
A very, very simplified debate on healthcare, for example. All that.
I haven't had the success I wish I had. It's hard to get through. Look, I'll give an example, a perfect example, and here it's in personal terms. For better or for worse, I know where all the bodies are buried in the programs in the State Department on trafficking, on fistula, on internet freedom, on all the issues like prison reform, to make American foreign aid dependent on meeting baseline humanitarian standards in third world prisons. We should pass laws that say that if there's not enough food in a prison to eat, we're going to cut your foreign aid no matter what else we do. We can do that. Somebody told me if we had a program like that, there are 20,000 in Africa, if you could just get African countries to put tarpaulin over the outdoor courtyards during the rainy season, you could save 10,000 lives a year. I know how to do it. I said at the beginning, there's the undersecretary, the J undersecretary at the State Department. As it happens, I have a whole bunch of people, everybody from left and right, interestingly, it's on the stationery, by the way, my support letter of the Lantos Foundation. And I've got, all sorts of people. They haven't filled the job. It's hard to get through. These are great fights to make, but my hope here is not on grounds of idealism and doing the right thing. It's to tell these politicians, you're crazy. You're down by 32 points with college-educated women. Why not become, and Trump is the symbol of being cruel and the worst kind of person towards women. How about becoming the Abraham Lincoln to the enslaved women of the world? It's wide open for you to do it. Well, I haven't yet made a good enough case. I wish I could write better. I keep asking John, who writes well, to write some great article talking about my great ideas and why everybody should adopt it. And he keeps saying he's going to write this great article, and I'm waiting for it to happen.
Okay.
But we keep trying.
Let me suggest other people who might do that. But I want to suggest to you that you didn't answer one aspect of the question. And I mean, what you do know, in fact, the individual scholars and the
Yes.
think tanks where the best work is being
There's
done.
no question about it. I think the think tanks have obviously made a difference. The think tanks in the United States have not only evened the score, but on the policy debate about conservative, left versus right, it used to be thought that conservatives had no ideas. The left were the only, what an oxymoron is, the opposite thing. The idea of a conservative intellectual was what? It's not possible. Well, the conservative think tanks over a period of 20, 30 years have just changed the dynamic so that the ideas seem to be coming from the right, from conservatives, on policy. They have evened the policy score, but I keep hoping that conservatives will even the moral debate. And I want the think tanks to do more, as they did on the economic debate, and I'm trying my best to get think tanks to focus on these issues, not with great success yet. They're too busy totting up the tax bill and what its implications will be for the economy, and not enough about internet firewalls and the trafficking of women. But as long as I got breath in me, I'm going to keep at it, and I think we're going to win that battle, because it's crazy not to win that battle. There's no downside cost, and the upside gains are so enormous that somehow we've got to win. Well, what I want to do is inspire somebody in an audience like this to do the job that I haven't been able to do. But I'll keep trying as best I can.
So you knew and you worked for the iconic conservative President Reagan, and
Yes.
in terms of lifestyle, habits of the mind, or political ideology, he was considered a real, authentic conservative. Can we say the same thing of President Donald Trump?
Of Trump? No, I don't think we can yet. That's the problem. I think Trump, I have hopes. I mean, I think some of the stuff he's doing on foreign policy, this stuff on North Korea, John Bolton, who is getting attacked as a warmonger and so forth. I've known John for 35 years. And just the way, when the Soviets were in power, our friend Richard Pearl was regarded as the Prince of Darkness, the man who wanted World War III. And when the Soviet Union was collapsing, all the Soviet generals wanted to get their picture taken with Richard Pearl, who they respected. And will be the same with North Korea and John Bolton. So there are good things happening, but he hasn't filled any of these jobs. And I try to get through to John and say, we've got to fill those jobs. I try to get through to somebody at the State Department, and he's out there exploiting grievance, exploiting anger, dividing more than he needs to. Now, there is legitimate anger on the part as people in, the elitist left that has total disregard for middle-class values and middle-class interests and contempt for religion and so forth. Of course there's anger. But I'm trying, it's hard just to break through. And look, I have worked at the White House, so these guys are friends of mine forever, and they're working at the White House. They're so busy putting out fires that to get them to sit down and think strategically about a larger thing is impossible. But if there's one person who has the room to move and to play against type, as we say, it's Donald Trump. He has yet to do it, unfortunately.
I want to pick up this point because we've had discussions relative to what you've just said in the past. And this is this. You were, in fact, a labor negotiator for unions at one point in your career. And you've always said, when these kind of topics have come up, that negotiating with, let's say, North Korea over human rights, as Reagan had to negotiate with the Soviet Union, was important because human rights was something that put those nations on the defensive and led to other things. But,
Absolutely. Let me, again, the human rights side on foreign policy. I've talked about it in terms of domestic policy. I've talked about it in terms of politics. But let's talk about it in foreign policy a little bit more and what Reagan understood. North Korea is evil. There are 400,000 people in prisons, in death sentence things, One of the tragedies, by the way, of the war in Iraq was that George Bush really did understand the need to go out against North Korea and to bring it down. But when the whole controversy over Iraq took place, he could only fight war on one front, not on two, so he had to surrender to the State Department on North Korea. We focus only on their missiles, but not on their gulags. Just what Reagan would never have done. I've always thought to bring down this regime, we shouldn't even be focusing on North Korea. We should be focusing on China, which keeps the regime alive, and pointing out that you are sustaining gulags of the most horrible sort and starvation and madness of every kind. China is a country which is less ideological than any other country. It's all cost against benefit. And if you make the cost of China too great, they're out of there in policy. Well, why don't we have, hundreds of thousands? Well, I'll tie it to my thing. I went to the Korean American church community leaders, big Korean American church community. I said, why don't you just have 24/7 marches outside the Chinese embassy? Every 3 hours, have a different church, a different group, marching quietly outside the Chinese embassy saying, let my people go. Stop supporting terror and murder. And do it for 3 months, rain, shine, night, day, hot, cold. Just bring the attention, put it on the table, the issue of North Korea, and make China accountable for it. Let me tell you, to the Chinese, and make certain concessions to the Chinese that are reasonable. If we had focused on the gulags, we could have done much more to bring the regime down, but in being indifferent to the human rights side, we would. And I'll give one example other on that score. The State Department was conducting what was called six-party talks over North Korea. And they were all dealing with missiles. And it was all China was our partner in trying to stop the regime from having missiles and so forth. And North Korea stopped the six-party talks. They were bothersome. Somebody came into George Bush, this is before the Iraq War heated up, a young man, and gave him a book. It was called The Aquariums of Pyongyang. Story of a young man whose whole family was kept in the gulags of North Korea. It was a very powerful book. And Bush read it, and he got excited about it, and everybody came into the Oval Office. He said, you got to read this book. I called up the South Korean newspapers and said, North Korea has stopped the six-party talks. I have inside information. They're going to call for the six-party talks to begin again. How do you know? Trust me. You write your story, say the six-party talks are about to begin. Why did I say it? Because George Bush was making human rights the issue, giving out those books. Guess what? Within 2 months, within 2 weeks of the time I started making the calls, the North Koreans said, hey, we got to start the six-party talks about nuclear weapons. They had to take the issue away from human rights, which is, people think that dictatorships are powerful and muscular and unified and democracies are weak. I don't have to tell people in Hungary, in due course, the opposite is true. It's terrible that we have not focused on the gulags of North Korea, and had we done so as Reagan did with the Soviet Union, I think we could have brought that regime down and made it too expensive for China to keep that regime alive.
Hello, Giovanna, U.S. and EU. You answered one question about North Korea. Thank you about that strategy. What I wanted to ask you is, you touched upon the Syrian refugee issue a little bit, which is a human rights issue, obviously, which everybody wants to stay away from. They're villainized, or they're whatever. How would you, or what would you recommend as a strategy in that area's human rights, United States position on the Syrian refugee issues?
The Syrian refugees.
Yes, because they're not all radical
Yes,
Muslims, et cetera.
Syrian refugees are a very interesting issue. The United States refugee policy, by the way, is very clear. The only people entitled to a green card are people who are subject to genocide and persecution. If you are war displaced, It's a very painful, terrible life. But you're not entitled to a refugee status under American law. And yet, Christians were absolutely in the Syrian villages. They were murdered when ISIS came into the villages. And when we admitted the United States 10,000 Syrian refugees, I don't think more than 200 were Christians. They were all Muslims. And that had to do with the policy notion that we can't seem like we're anti-Muslim. Now, let me tell you a little secret. When the United States was formulating its policy, I know many European governments and the Canadian government went to the United States and said, don't admit too many Christians because it'll make us look bad for admitting all these Muslims. And the United States bent to the pressures of Europe on this issue. So here we violated our own immigration laws just to prove that we weren't discriminating. And we did not subject these refugees to the test of whether or not they carried the virus of anti-Semitism with them, so that we ran the same risks that Europe and France and so we must be, if you establish enough credibility of caring and decency through all the issues I've talked about, if you begin to own the caring issue, if you don't only sound muscular and angry, then you can speak truth about these issues. And then you can say Christians are being the ones persecuted and we must take them in, and we must test for people coming in from Muslim countries, not because there's a war for the soul of Islam, and we've got to come out on the side of the people who want to fight the fascists who are taking it over. If we could sustain that kind of approach, we could have the right kinds of policies, and we wouldn't, nobody calls me an anti-Muslim bigot, and I take a very hard line because I fought the Ku Klux Klan to integrate the University of Mississippi, because I am responsible for the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the Sudan Peace Act and the North Korea Human Rights. All conservative, none of which involves spending a lot of money, and all in the face of indifference to too many people in the conservative community. So it's really a strategic question of giving us the freedom to once we shatter the caricature, speaking truth becomes possible without being called bigots.
But the gentleman here.
Yes. Thank you. I'm just looking at this. Thank you. I'm Alexander, a historian from Hungary, and I'm going back to China and Japan because there is a funny competition between China and Japan, if so. So the first part of the question, how you can evaluate this competition first. In the banking sphere in Manhattan district, as far as I know, more and more banks are owned by hands of Japanese and Chinese businessmen. They have a good, healthy competition between themselves because the competition is the matter of the business. On the other hand, that on the Pacific Ocean, there is some competition in development of the military forces of Japan and China. And in Europe too, we are speaking about imposing of China European economy, but Japan is coming too. So the question is how can you evaluate this competition from the point of view of the interest of the United States? What is the and of Europe too, if you can evaluate it, can we get some balance with Japan against the dominance of China? What's the situation in the United States?
Well, let me answer the question in a very interesting, maybe frightening way for you. The United States is a country of immigrants. Our big immigration is now coming from Asia, not anymore from Europe. You know, when you raise children, if you got two in a room, they play with each other. If you get three in a room, one child is left all by himself. If Europe treats the United States in the way many of its leaders do, the United States is perfectly capable. Even Obama talked about a tilt to Asia. And instead of our principal allies being Germany and the EU and France and even England, we can look to Korea, Japan, India as the great alliance and the high priority interest, and leave Europe all to itself with its euros and its and so forth. It'll be a very problematic thing. I think the Europeans really need to understand that America has very much a strategic capacity to shift our priorities to India, Korea, and Japan. And there's real reason for doing so. And I think the Europeans are going to have to work hard to earn the loyalty and trust of the United States, a lot harder than the European politicians, many European politicians on the left think is the case. And let me tell you, if the United States says, look, that's enough of your antitrust laws, enough of your anti-Americanism, enough of your this, enough of your that, we're going to go to India and Japan, where the markets exist, where there's support and trust for the United States. The isolation of Europe will be devastating for your economies here, and I think that is a risk that has not been taken. Now, there's also the other reason. India and Japan and Korea are great examples of freedom. It's the freedom agenda here that the United States, the Reagan freedom agenda, the Thatcher, the Pope John Paul freedom agenda. And that freedom agenda is being pursued. That battle is being fought very much in Asia with Chinese dominance. Now, my hope for the future is a 21st century where the West and China compete to build better cars and computers. My grandchildren live very, very well. But it is entirely true, I think, that the United States has got to have a much greater focus on our alliance with India, Korea, and Japan in order to compete with and restrain and take on China. Because let me again say, just on the internet firewall, the premier of China said the following, as I may have said, if I cannot purify the internet, I can't even stay alive. The Iranians say the same thing. So China is much more fragile. Like all dictatorships, they seem muscular. They're very weak and fragile. And freedom gets them, as Reagan understood. As you in Hungary understand better than anybody else. I wish the Eastern European countries took a lead role in successfully educating America about the freedom agenda and about the importance and about how weak dictatorships are, and they don't need to be appeased. That people within those countries really have a yearning for freedom, and we can exploit that and weaken those governments. That's what I think we ought to do, and that's the response to China.
Could I suggest to you, please, first of all, when you discussed about screening for anti-Semitism as a requirement before a refugee would be accepted, what about substituting it with, are you anti-Christian? That would cover anti-Christian, because that would actually cover everybody, and it would be much more personal, up close and personal.
No.
Anti-Semitism is pretty hackneyed at this point.
It isn't. It
Well,
is
I mean,
the ace
it
card
isn't.
by which the left trumps the right. Let me tell you,
Okay.
because you have a history of Nazism, of iron crosses, of all that stuff, and they lay it on you. But go ahead. I don't mean to interrupt.
All
Yes.
right, okay, fine, just something to
I'm sorry.
consider. Moment, sorry. It's
sorry,
about the
I
issue.
apologize.
The issue of Christians not defending Christian persecution abroad. Okay, so it's something that I'm also aware of, and I'm wondering why Christians have not taken up this cause, because for centuries and centuries they've been in the, I don't want to use the expression positions of power, but they've been dominant, and the kind of self-assuredness that comes with that, and that to be in a position where Christians are now being persecuted, this is novel. This is a whole new paradigm shift.
Yes.
And I think they're completely ill-equipped to deal with it.
Okay, two things. First, I'm not against anybody being anti-Christian. I really am not. People can say Christianity is terrible. People can say Christianity is what did Lenin call it, the opiate of the masses. They're wrong.
Okay, but I am not saying this also at all.
But you say
Okay.
a test for anti-Christian. I am for a test for people who want to murder Christians, not for people who don't like. But I couldn't agree with you more. I think we need to have sophisticated tests for people coming in who will be able to assimilate into our value system. Let me also add that on the immigration thing, if I can just make a somewhat separate point. In Europe, you don't have much experience with immigration. You've had pretty much the same gene pool for the last umpty-ump thousand years. In America, we have some experience with immigration. And one of the things that the left really doesn't understand when they want to protect these Muslims from being discriminated against and so forth is there is nothing more difficult than to be an immigrant assimilating into a country. My father was born in Poland. I look as American as George Washington, but my father was born in Poland. And he tells the story of how in his youth he was ashamed of his father, who had a funny accent. And he felt there was a lot of discrimination against him. After he began to feel confident that he was fully American, he would say he felt ashamed of himself for feeling ashamed of his father. But there is no sugarcoating. There is no soft landing for immigrants. And if those Muslims, the idea, those people, if I had Amnesty International protecting my grandfather from discrimination, I would be a tailor or a waiter today, not the good life I had, because my family discovered the strengths within themselves and were forced to assimilate into a Western culture. But it was possible, it was the self-confidence of the West to be able to do that, and the labels that the left puts on us make it impossible for us to allow Muslim immigrants to successfully integrate. It's a very interesting thing, by the way, when I hear all this talk about bigotry against the Muslims. I haven't heard anybody in Hungary talk about, let's keep Koreans out. Let's keep people from India out. You want them in here. They are productive. They integrate into society. They can assimilate better. But we're talking about Islam in the middle of this struggle for who it is and how it will turn out. It's a hard road for Muslims, that immigration process. And we have to be able to say, yes, there will be pain without being called bigots. As I say, I can do it because of my story and my experience. It can be done. Now, let me just say one thing about Christians, not protecting Christians. I just gave a talk to a Christian group in the United States, a summit meeting of Christian leaders on why Christians don't care about Christians. And here were all these leaders saying, it's terrible, all these fellow Christians don't care about persecution of Christians. And my response to it was, you know what you're really saying? You're saying, I'm a good Christian, but those people in the churches, they're not as good as I am. They don't care as much as I do. I said, you don't intend to do it. The fact of the matter is, until you devise careful, shrewd strategies to defeat the caricature of Christians in the society, which you as leaders need to do, you can't expect anybody to follow you. If all you're telling Christians is get angry about Christians being persecuted, pray about it, they'll pray and the persecution will be just as bad, and then they'll say, well, it's not in the Lord's time for Christians to be free. What you've got to do is do the sorts of things I'm talking about. Have Christian leadership on the trafficking of women. Begin talking about how Muslims are the victims of these Islamic societies. Talk about prison reform. The great leaders. Who were the great leaders of the Christian West? Wilberforce in England. He didn't lead the battle for people to feel good about Christians. He led the battle against slavery. Chuck Colson in the United States led the battle for prison reform. Once he fought for prisoners, then he could fight for Christians, and people couldn't say you just are fighting for your own. So I would say there's a great failing on the part, just as I've been saying here before, of Christian leadership in not devising strategies that defeat the caricatures that make it possible for the left to label Christians as the bad guys. And the fault is the leadership. The fault is not the good people in the pews. The fault is not the good people of countries like Hungary or the United States. The fault is leadership in not being strategic about the need to defeat the label that the left paints on us. Not forcing the left to earn it's a good standing, rather than simply have it assumed no matter what they do.
Thank you, Michael. Just
Okay.
to add
I just
to-
had one last sentence, which is my pessimism. I'm sorry. You still have hope
Oh,
that the
we're
left,
gonna win.
Democrats.
We're gonna win. Goodness gracious.
My sense is
Of course we
that
will.
no matter what kind of argument is marshaled, to be reasonable,
Yes.
to present,
Yes. You
there's
are,
an absolute
you
wall
are
at this
so wrong.
point.
I cannot begin to tell you from
You
my
have to
experience.
find me these people because I haven't seen them lately.
Listen, I am the only non-Christian who won the Wilberforce Prize, which is the great prize that Colson gives. It is the greatest prize in many ways that the American Christian community gives once a year. I won the Wilberforce Prize, the only non-Christians to do it. And amongst all these Christians, I have to tell this story. I used to get introduced all the time, and people would say, "What is this Jew out here fighting for persecuted Christians?" Well, what makes, we can't understand that, because I was out there telling Christians, I'm going to shame you until you start fighting for your people. I'm going to tell you, you have a right to be proud of the traditions you've created. You've helped shape America, which has been a blessed land for me. People respond to that. And I used to get introduced, I have to tell this story, I used to get introduced in meetings of Christians, why is this Jew out here, the person who's fighting for us? And then there would be a pause and somebody would say, well, 2,000 years ago there was another Jew who started, that was my introduction. So I have a very, very powerful rapport with Christian leaders here, and I can be very critical of them, and I receive lots of, and I'm very honest and candid with them, and don't you fall for the caricature. The reason that, no, but I'm telling you, the reason why Christians have a wall, or the outside world has a wall to Christians, is the failure of Christian leadership to understand what Wilberforce did, to understand what Chuck Colson did. Christians fight on the battle of abortion in the United States, and they call my wife a baby killer because she supports abortion. Doesn't sound very Christian to me. If instead they went to my wife and said, I wish you could understand a fetus is a vulnerable human being and I care, but please know that I care about the fetus the same way I care about trafficked women, there could be debate and discussion. So the fault, I say, is largely the fault of Christian leaders for the wall, you say, that exists that doesn't allow people who are not Christians to see what it is that you mean to the world and what you stand for. It's your fault, not their fault.
Just to weigh in on Janet's side, her question was answered some years ago here by the late Kenneth Minogue, the Australian political theorist, and he said that the reason he thought, and he invented, I think, or certainly he was one of the first people to use the word Christophobia. He said the reason why Western elites, particularly in foreign policy, are Christophobic was because they wanted to persuade the leaders of other countries from different religions and cultures that institutions like the international courts and the UN and the rest were the products not of Christian thought, not deriving from the Christian traditions in Western societies, but they were an entirely different animal. And therefore, if you're a Muslim or a Hindu or a Buddhist, you needn't feel at all embarrassed about in joining these institutions and supporting them. Frankly, Ken thought, and I think probably a lot of people would agree, this is a completely ridiculous strategy because you can't convince Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists that Western institutions don't grow in some sense from previous Christian thought. But nonetheless, it is an interesting argument.
John, I really have to say, my closest friend for many years was a man named Shahbaz Bhatti. Shahbaz was the Minister of Minority Alliance in Pakistan, formed the All-Pakistan Minority Alliance, had 1,000, I mean literally, probably 1,000 fatwas to kill him. Shahbaz would get up on the floor of the Pakistani parliament. He was one of the two non-Muslim delegates or members of the parliament, and he'd make a speech in favor of Israel. When he'd come off the floor, 50 of his colleagues said, thank you, thank you, thank you. We can't say it, but God bless you for saying that sort of thing. Shabazz would complain to me all the time. He'd say, when I'm the biggest friend of America, and there's more support for what I have to do than you could imagine, and yet when American diplomats come, they never want to meet with me. They want to meet with the radical anti-Americans. All the time it would happen. And Shabazz then got a statement signed by the 4 principal imams of Pakistan in favor of religious tolerance, because the imams knew that the radical Muslims were going to take them over as well. It got no support from the West and none from the State Department. And so the imam said, if we can't even get support from the U.S., we're not going to speak out anymore. The short version is Shabazz was machine gunned down in front of his house. We could have supported him more. And there's more opening within Islam, within all of those faiths, to the common message of a dignity of man. I don't want to be utopian about it, but I'm telling you that there's more openness to what it is that we offer that's why they want to come live in our countries, than we give ourselves credit for.
Thank you. The last question.
Yeah, thank you. My question is that what do you think, who should lead the fight for the rights of the white community in South Africa? And would you comment the situation over there?
The rights of the white community in South Africa. Well, again, there's a whole history of apartheid that's there, and it's that history that defines them. I don't know. I would say, that I don't know enough about South Africa, but I would say, well, I put it this way. There is our upper middle class character defines freedom in terms of some politician getting a job. So all blacks are free because Mandela is the president of South Africa. Not sure. I mean, I don't know what's happened to jobs and economic productivity and freedom and so forth. So I think they're really, once again, it gets to the point I'm making, not defensively, but if there are leaders in South Africa who can show that they're in politics not to stay in power or maintain their power, but that they have a moral responsibility that they take seriously to allow the blacks in South Africa to see that their children lead better lives than they do. Again, I don't want to be utopian about it, but if you have some credibility on that score, leadership becomes possible. But if all you're going to do is say, they're taking away our farmland and it's terrible, the world's not going to listen. And if that's what South African leadership is, you're going to get Winnie Mandela as president of South Africa, and the world is not going to care. So I do think it has to do with winning and fighting, and understand the priority need to fight for a moral, the moral standing without sacrificing conservative or religious principles. It is possible, not only possible, it is necessary for us to do it. And whenever you have people whose inherent decency, they are inherently decent and conservative, like Reagan, like John Paul, as the great book that John has written about John Paul, Thatcher, and Reagan changed the world. Go read John's book about what those three people did to change the world, and that's part of an answer about how to deal with what's going on in South Africa. So let's get more popes like John Paul, presidents like Reagan, and let's get guys like Orban to understand that anger alone that there's a much richer, deeper vein that he's got to tap, if he's capable of it, in order to have. To close with this, I was saying that this is what Orban ought to do, and somebody said, nah, Orban doesn't care. The only thing he cares about is better relations with Trump. That's his big thing. My answer to that is, there are a lot of people in the Trump administration who would really like to be more friendly to Orban and to Sisi, for example, in Egypt. But the political price of aligning with Orban, who's defined as some racist, anti-Semite, the political price of doing it is too high. So if Orban begins to talk about, aside from any other problems he may have, but if I were advising him, I'd say, listen to what Horowitz has to say, if only because if you say it more, it'll be much easier for the Trump administration, without cost, to be more open and friendly and to be in greater alliance with you.
Mike,
No.
thank you. I didn't mention in my introduction, though you won't be surprised to hear, that a few years ago, one of the Southern American evangelical magazines named Mike Christian of the Year. And he dined out on this for some time, but was always happy with the designation because, of course, I think it's a tribute to the fact that, among other things that Mike picked up in his conversations with other human rights groups and with evangelical Christians, is a terrific oratorical style. I think that no Baptist preacher could have put on a better performance in favor of human rights here today. And I think we've had a lesson in the many different ways in which human rights play a part in our politics and will play a bigger part in our future politics if we're going to survive and prosper. So I want to thank you very warmly indeed, Mike. Thank you.